Well, thank you so much for having me. I walked into the library this morning, half an hour ago, and it was like overwhelmed by all these great feelings. I don't know about you all, but I have such a great association with public libraries from my childhood, and so that every time it's the reverse of those trigger warnings where people get upset about something. When I walk in a library, I get all this great positive feeling. So I really appreciate being asked to talk with you today. I thought that I would start by reading a little bit just to give you a flavor for the book, and then tell you a little bit more about the whole structure of the book and why I wrote it, some background, then maybe do a little bit more reading, and then leave plenty of time for questions from you. I always enjoy that part the best. So this is from the intro, and I apologize to those of you who may have already read it or who have heard me speak many times. Barb, I'm looking at you. So this is from the intro, kind of bring you in. June 10th, 2018. It's a typical summer day in Nebraska, hot, humid, hazy. An insistent wind blows the heat around like a convection oven. We are on a farm. Yes, there will be corn. The farmers, Art and Helen Tanderup, are white and in their 60s. Art is portly, a bit aloof and gruff. Helen exudes both stand-by-your-man, farm wife, and tough as nails, take no crap, rural woman. This farm has been in Helen's family ever since the late 19th century, pioneering days. If you are imagining a 2-story clapboard farmhouse circa 1900 with a big porch surrounded by a tangle of rose bushes, dignified old shade trees, and a generous circle of grass, you'd be right. Art is preparing to plant corn in his field near Neely in north-central Nebraska, and Helen is working the kitchen. But the tractor remains in the barn, and the big sacks of field corn, the kernels all the same size and the same weak yellow color, sit unopened in the utility shed. Art won't be planting those today. Instead, about 100 people are slowly gathering to help Art sow something else on his land by hand. They come bearing small, beaded bags of seeds. Poured out in your palm, they are dusty blue, pomegranate red, with some cream and butter thrown in. These sowers have also brought tubs of potato salad and coleslaw, hefty watermelons, and still warm pies, and many are pitching in to help Helen serve the large crowd. Perhaps, you think, it's a neighborly barn raising, a return to the homesteading era. Maybe you feel a little nostalgic just thinking about it if you're from a farm family, or if your childhood diet of pop culture was filled with such scenes, as mine was. But this isn't a reunion of pioneer families. Many of the visitors are members of the Ponca tribe, separated by federal fiat into northern Nebraska and southern Oklahoma branches for over 135 years. Indians from other nearby tribes, the Omahas, Winnebagos, and Santee Sioux, also have come to the gathering. They ride up to the Tanderup's farm in fully decked-out pickups. They tumble out of their trucks, laughing in shorts, jeans, and flip-flops. Some of the women dress in handmade calico skirts ringed with ribbons. Some sport hand-beaded accessories. There are non-Indians, too, in their baseball caps and cargo shorts, their Birkenstocks and sneakers. Kids turn cartwheels on the grass. Their grandparents lounge in folding chairs near the big utility shed where the food will be served. It's clear from the hugs and smiles, the comfortable ease, that many of these people have known one another for a while. Indeed, these modern and ancient corn planters had originally come together in 2013 to oppose a transnational oil pipeline, the Keystone XL, that would bisect the Tanderup's land and the homelands of the Poncas. These strangers didn't know each other then, but they shared a common concern that a pipeline spill would contaminate the water quietly flowing underground in the Ogallala Aquifer. They feared the poisoned water would disperse for hundreds of miles. and I'm going to skip a little bit here. The Keystone XL protesters strategized politically, but they also became closer as they worked together. And Art Tandrup started something where he had what was called a spirit camp on his land, and he brought together a lot of native tribes and other people who, non-natives, who wanted to work together. So the Keystone XL protesters strategized politically, but they also became closer as they tended the spirit camp fire, made and shared meals, prayed together, and told stories. Most attendees left at twilight as the temperature dropped and night set in, but a few hardy souls remained. A bunch of us would stay, and we would go into the teepee, and we had a fire in there, Art recalls, and we could take our coats off and be nice and comfy, and we would sit around and talk about things. Mika C. Horonek from the Ponca tribe of Oklahoma was one of those who stayed during the cozy evenings in the teepee. From him and other Poncas, the Tandrups learned the tribe's history. The Poncas had been a small tribal nation. By the 1870s, they numbered just about 700. In the early 1800s, they lived for most of each year in a village where the Niobrara River greets the Missouri River, about 50 miles north of the Tandrups' farm. One of those tranquil nights in the spirit camp teepee, Mikasi told the Tandrups that in the mid-1870s, the U.S. government decided to forcibly move his tiny tribe to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. Most of the tribal members refused to go. The government brought 60 members of the cavalry to force the Poncas to move. As Chief White Eagle described it, the soldiers got on their horses, went to all the houses, broke open our doors, took our household utensils, put them in their wagons, and pointing their bayonets at our people, ordered them to move. In the teepee, as the fire crackled and bathed each person in an amber light, Mikasi told the Tandrups the story of what happened on the Poncas Trail of Tears. Their ancestors had trudged over this very spot 136 years earlier. Storms pummeled them almost every day of their 600-mile journey. Many died on the long walk, including an 18-month-old child, White Buffalo Girl, who was buried nearby and kneeling. When they finally arrived in Indian Territory after 55 days, the government had not made any provisions for their new home. The Poncas, who'd been living in wooden frame houses in Nebraska, now had to huddle in makeshift tents. They had arrived too late to plant crops, so they faced starvation, and about a quarter of the tribe succumbed to malaria and other diseases. What happened to the Poncas also happened to hundreds of other indigenous groups in every territory and state of the United States. We could call what happened something benign, something euphemistic, and we often do. We could label it westward expansion, winning of the West, pioneering, homesteading. Even in 2019, a New York Times writer dubbed it opening the West. But what happened to the Poncas and other American Indian nations was theft. And it can be deeply uncomfortable for many people who are non-native like myself and probably most of you. It can be deeply uncomfortable for us settlers, to face the illegitimate foundations upon which our settlement is based. It's hard to acknowledge that we settlers are trespassers on native land. We have been taught through our formal education and countless informal messages to believe that we are entitled to be here. And it can unsettle us, literally, to realize that our settler histories of triumph are inextricably intertwined with indigenous histories of theft. So I want to skip a little bit further on and just sort of tell you the story that Mikasi mentioned to Art Tandrup and Helen Tandrup. Not only his history, but he had an idea that he shared with Art Tandrup. Mikasi and other Poncas shared their dreams for the future in the spirit camp teepee. Mikasi told the Tandrups, "Our people lost the sacred corn when we were removed to Oklahoma, and it would be great to bring that corn back to its homeland. So this stirred the Tanderups to decide, well, let's plant your corn on our land. And they set aside several acres of land to do that each year. So ever since then, the Poncas have been converging on the Tanderups family farm twice a year, first in the early summer to plant their corn and then in the fall to harvest it. The 5th year of Ponca corn planting at the Tanderup farm is special. Before the planting begins, a ceremony is held. 4 VIPs sit in front of a large table covered with a bison robe. Art Tanderup sits on one end. Larry Wright Jr., who was the chair of the Northern Ponca tribe at the time, is seated on the other. Helen nestles cozily between her husband and Casey Camp Horonek, a councilwoman of the Southern Ponca tribe of Oklahoma. Almost exactly 160 years ago, Ponca chiefs had signed over millions of acres of their homelands to the U.S. government, later to be redistributed as homesteads to people like Helen Tanderup's family. And today, on this topsy-turvy farm, instead of the Poncas giving up more of their land, Art and Helen Tanderup are signing a different kind of treaty, a deed that returns the Poncas' 10-acre corn plot to them. And so it's this ceremony that is sort of the launching point for the book. And one thing I always like to tell non-Nebraskan audiences is that who would have thunk that Nebraska would be a hotbed of truth and reconciliation efforts, because this is really what was happening here on the Tanderup's farm in miniature. The Ponca people there got up and talked about what had happened in their past. They bore witness to what had happened. And then Art and Helen Tanderup issued an apology to the Poncas for what had happened, even though they had not been personally responsible for it. And then they transferred 10 acres of land to the Ponca. So this is a remarkable sort of occasion that we don't hear a lot about these kinds of things, but they're happening all over the country, and that they became somewhat of an inspiration for writing this book. So originally this book was going to be about, it was called, Does the United States Need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? And luckily, one of my friends told me, Margaret, that's a terrible title. Well, one, I mean, it's just not very inviting. And for me, like, I already had an answer in mind. And so if you already have an answer in mind, it's probably not a good title, or if it's a yes or no answer, right? The intent of the original book was to compare what was going on in other countries like Canada and Australia, who have been having these very long, involved, well-funded national processes to explore what happened in the past, especially around Indigenous children and their removal from their families. So Australia, for example, had a Stolen Generations inquiry in the 1990s. They gathered testimony from thousands and thousands of Aboriginal people who had been separated from their families as children. And then Canada had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that went on for 6 years that was about its Indian residential schools. And so I looked with a kind of envy on these countries and, as a historian, because they were really confronting their histories and trying to do something about them. So originally the book was going to be kind of, well, what's going on in these countries? What could we learn from this? But in the process, one of the first things I did in launching the book was I wanted to interview as many people as possible in the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand who were working for reconciliation, truth and reconciliation. And it turned out that many of the interviews that we, and I'll explain the we in a minute, ended up doing were with not these like top level people who were on the commissions, but who were everyday people like Art and Helen Tanderup. One of the decisions I made in the book too was, or in launching the book was, I wanted to work with, I wanted to actually have a kind of reconciliation experience in my own life when I was working on the book. I wanted to work with Native people, partner with Native people on doing these interviews. And so I reached out to a local Native journalist named Kevin Aberusk, and many of you may know Kevin. He's from Rosebud, Lakota originally. He's lived in Lincoln a very long time. He's a journalist who's worked for the Journal Star many, many years, and now he works for an Indian-owned news source called Indians.com. And Kevin and I have been working since 2018. We created a multimedia project called Reconciliation Rising. And through this, we've been doing lots of interviews with people. Our first interview was with a famous Nebraskan named Roger Welsh, who we just recently lost. And our second interview was with Art and Helen Tanderup and with Larry Wright Jr. on their land. And so it was that project that led me to do the book very differently, as you can tell. It's much more about these kind of grassroots truth and reconciliation efforts and how they fit into this larger world and global context where it's very interesting to see that this is happening worldwide, that we are really reckoning with these difficult histories, these painful histories, and then trying to do something about it. So a little bit more, the first half of the book, in my mind, is about truth. And the second half of the book is about reconciliation. And I've gotten a lot of feedback from people that say, Margaret, that first half of your book is really tough. And it is. I mean, I focus the first half of the book on the places I've lived the longest in my life. And I grew up in Colorado, so there's a good piece of the book about Colorado. And then I've lived in Nebraska now for almost 20 years, and so a lot of the book is about Nebraska as well. And I think that's something I learned from doing these interviews, is how important it was for those of us who are non-native to actually become very deeply knowledgeable about the place where we live, and to understand how did the land that we live on here in Lincoln pass from the hands of indigenous people to non-native people, and what has that meant long term. And so I wanted to do that myself. Even though I'm a historian, a professional historian, I had never really done that deep dive into the history of the place I grew up in Colorado or here in Nebraska. So I want to just share with you a very, very brief excerpt from the truth section. And I'm not going to read the really hard parts, but so you may know that one of the probably most well-known and most really awful, horrific incidents was the Sand Creek Massacre that occurred in Colorado in 1864. And I grew up in Colorado. I never, ever learned of this massacre in school. I was a history major at Stanford University. I never learned of this massacre as a history major. Then I went on for a PhD in American history, and I did learn a lot about indigenous history, but I still didn't learn about this massacre. And it was only many years later when I was working as a professor. I was like one of those adjunct professors that travels around to 5 different schools in one day. But I was in Colorado again, and I was asked to teach Colorado history. And then it's like, oh, I need to bone up on Colorado history, and that's when I finally learned about this massacre. So I won't go into the gory details of it. I just want to share with you a little bit of how I try to write about this as a non-native person. It was just over 100 years after the Sand Creek Massacre that my family moved to the Front Range of Colorado. Every year as a child, I treasured the gradual shift from fall to winter. When I woke up each morning, I would lie warm under the covers and gaze out my window, the sun rising over Rampart Range. On some days, a gentle snow would be falling, muffling the day's noises, coaxing me back to sleep if it weren't a school day. On most days, the morning light would gradually flood the backyard, growing in intensity and brilliance. The cottonwoods down by the creek no longer had their leaves, but they stood as familiar sentinels, offering a comforting shelter around our 1960s ranch house. It was Fountain Creek that streamed through my backyard and skittered down Ute Pass. It gurgled through Manitou Springs, then got channeled through concrete culverts in Colorado Springs. It turned south and eventually burst free from its industrial straits. It grew wider and muddier as it headed to Pueblo. There it rushed headlong into the Arkansas River, which came down from its mountain home and rolled out across the plains to the east. Other little creeks also met up with the Arkansas. One of these was Big Sandy Creek, or Sand Creek. It was often dry parts of the year. At other times, its waters would mingle in the Arkansas with the water that had journeyed from my backyard. I had so little idea of what had transpired in this place where I grew up, on this land that I love so much. When I became a historian of the West, I learned to sift through accounts of the past, to gauge the credibility of a source, to weigh the eyewitness accounts against the media puff pieces. And the truth of settler crimes at Sand Creek and at so many other sites of terror and trauma became inescapable. It horrified me to learn, and it still never fails to appall me, that the place I grew up in was founded in such a way, through deceit and through the most brutal violence imaginable. So that gives you kind of a sense of the truth section of the book. And as I mentioned, it focuses a lot on Colorado and Nebraska. It focuses particularly on the Cheyenne and Arapaho people in Colorado, and in Nebraska, the Ponca and the Pawnees. It's interesting because both of these states turned out to have a huge role in propelling many non-natives to become very concerned and very outraged by what was happening to indigenous peoples in the 19th century. So I really talk about, in the 19th century, there was kind of a really early truth and reconciliation movement, but people didn't call it that then. And it really was sparked by a speaking tour by the Ponca chief Standing Bear. And he spoke all over the East Coast, and he mobilized all these people who had once been fervent anti-slavery abolitionists. He mobilized all of them to become very fervently opposed to the policies against Native people. But the book talks about how this movement for reconciliation in the 19th century went awry. It turned instead toward kind of non-Native people thinking they knew what was best for Native people. It began by really focusing on returning land to the Ponca people, or returning the Ponca to their land and returning land to other Native groups. But it quickly moved into a very different agenda, and that agenda was really about assimilation of Native people through Indian boarding schools and through the allotment of Indian lands. So then the second half of the book really looks at what we're doing today to reconcile from these past practices, and it uses those 19th century things, which turned out to cause more harm. It uses them as a kind of cautionary tale to think, well, like, if we're interested in being accountable for what happened in the past today, what could we learn from the past? And what could we learn from Canada and Australia and New Zealand about what has worked or not worked in those countries? And finally, the book ends the last section, and if you can make it through the truth section, I promise the reconciliation section is much more positive and hopefully inspiring and moving. Certainly the interviews we did with people were inspiring and moving to me, and I try to convey that in the book. So I'm going to just leave you with a little bit from the very end. I should say that the last third of the book, or quarter of the book, is really about the Pawnee people. And it's kind of a history of how they lived in this area and were removed from this area like the Ponca were, but how they're returning. And it really documents the case many of you may already know about, where Roger Welsh returned 60 acres of land to the Pawnee people, and which led to a kind of ripple effect where other Nebraskans decided to give land to the Pawnee people, and the Pawnee have a very active presence here now as a result of these land returns. And they also have a really dynamic corn planting project that goes on in Nebraska. So I want to just read a little bit at the end. So I think a common feeling that a lot of non-natives have is that this is scary to engage in these processes of working with indigenous people, especially when people raise the issue of land back, that people get like, oh, what do you mean by that? And are you going to take something from me, and this is going to be, you're going to make me feel bad, you're going to make me feel guilty and ashamed. So one of the things I wanted to do in the book is really convey that the opposite is actually the case for those people who have engaged in this. Many of us settlers think that if we acknowledge this history, we will walk around in a state of perpetual shame, a big red T for thief or trespasser emblazoned on our chest. We fear that we will be forced to give up something, land, money, or at the least a view of ourselves as the heroes of history. Many of us prefer continued denial. But not one settler that we interviewed who has taken part in reconciliation has ever mentioned shame or guilt. They commonly speak instead of gaining life-affirming friendships and a sense of interconnectedness with indigenous people. For those settlers who have repatriated land to Indian nations, not one has represented themselves as giving up or losing their land. Each reconciler has, in fact, expressed that it's they, not the Indian people they have known, who has been given a gift. And of all the conceptualizations of reconciliation that I have come across, it is that of an Australian Aboriginal land rights campaigner, and I cannot pronounce his name correctly, but it's something like Galarrwuy Yunupingu. It's his vision that has most captivated me. He declared in 2016 to the settler inhabitants of Australia, "Let us Aboriginal people be who we are, Aboriginal people in a modern world, and be proud of us. Acknowledge that we have survived the worst the past has thrown at us, and we are here with our songs, our ceremonies, our land, our language, and our people, our full identity. What a gift this is that we can give you if you choose to accept it in a meaningful way." And so I find this to be deeply humbling to learn that many Indigenous people conceive of reconciliation not in a transactional sense, as a way to settle old scores, but as a life-affirming and ongoing process of building respectful relationships and sharing gifts through reciprocity. So the book kind of comes full circle. It ends by describing more of the ceremony that happened at the Tanderups that day. And I'll just read you the very last part. On the Tanderups farm on that June day, Mikasi Horonek bears his gift. He sings his song to honor this day and that we could all be together in unity and strength and power as one family and one people. Wearing jeans and a turquoise t-shirt made for the occasion, he beats out a steady drum beat. His mother, Casey, ululates during certain parts of the song. He tells us afterward that the song says, "To the Creator, it's a beautiful path or a beautiful road that you've given this warrior to travel." He ends the ceremony by saying, "My children and grandchildren are here today, and they're going to remember this, and they're going to carry this throughout our oral history, what took place here today. I hope this is just a beginning, a new beginning for our people to come together in unity." As Art Tanderup says, in returning 10 acres of land to the Poncas, it's something that makes our hearts feel good. And that's where I'll end today. Thanks. questions, comments? Yeah.
I think the cover is beautiful. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So I just want to do everything I possibly could about this book in a spirit of reconciliation and a spirit of collaboration and partnership with Indigenous people. So I reached out to a Lakota and Ponca artist that is based in Omaha. She's a mutual friend. She's a mutual friends with somebody else that she is with, and I said, "Would you consider doing a cover for my book?" And I didn't know her; she didn't know me, and she said, "Oh, well, I'd consider it. Could you share some of the book with me?" So I sent her the introduction, and she wrote back almost immediately and said, "Yes, I'd love to do a cover on that." And then after she made the cover, I asked her if she'd explain some of the symbolism of it. And she's like, "Well, I'm an artist. I don't really like to talk about, I want people to take away what they take away." But she did share with me that this red symbol, which is very common in Lakota art, is in this case, it's meant to be kind of a beacon. And a lot of the other aspects of this represent growth, new growth after the sort of in the spring after these 100 winters. That is explained in the book, but I'm not going to explain it to you today.
Congratulations on the Nebraska Book Award for that.
Yeah, the cover won the Nebraska Book Award. So thanks to Sarah. Yeah.
Is there any other land for the northern Ponca that's set aside for the northern Ponca besides the 10 acres on the family?
Yeah, so, it's been somewhat controversial, but the Ponca have established a casino in Carter Lake, Iowa, and down just recently here in town. And they're using some of that money, some of it to establish like a health clinic, but they're also purchasing land back in their homelands up by the Niobrara River. So, so far, last I heard from them, they'd purchased 1,800 acres up in that area. And if you go up to Niobrara, it's a little bit hard to find their headquarters, but they have built a beautiful dance ground. They also have one of the statues of Chief Standing Bear, the same one that's in Washington, D.C. They have one out there, the same one that we have here in town. They've created a nature trail, an interpretive trail. They've built an earth lodge as an example. So they're using that casino money to buy land, reestablish a presence there. But sadly, as far as I know, nobody else has given more land back in that way. But and that, I think that's kind of, I can only imagine it'd be pretty painful to have to buy back land that was taken from you in that way. But I think tribes are just so value having some of their land back, some of their homelands back, that they're willing to do that. Yeah.
You probably know, but the Nebraska Trails Federation gave the Pawnees the land from Blue Springs to Kansas. That trail now belongs to them, and it's the trail that the Ponca people walked on their way to Oklahoma.
Yeah, and that's another great example. And I have to share with you that one of the things Kevin and I are doing is we're working on an hour-long documentary called The Land Returns, and we're trying to document. It's a grassroots movement that's happening across the country, where not just individuals, but environmental organizations, some cities, some corporations, churches are returning land to Native people. And this is a really great example of a very imaginative thing. It's like returning the land that was the Ponca Trail of Tears, or at least some of that land. And there's a short film about this as well that Nebraska Public Media did, where they documented when the Poncas went on this to recreate their Trail of Tears and went and celebrated the return of this trail. So, and we just were out in California this summer. We were filming in the city of Eureka, which returned an island to one of the indigenous groups in the area, and that was, again, incredibly inspiring and moving. I didn't come away thinking, oh gosh, that would be hard, that would be awful. I came away thinking, we should all be thinking about these imaginative ways to do this, and that we all win from these situations. We all start to heal from these returns of land and other gestures of reconciliation. Yeah.
Were the crops successful that they planted, and who cared for them, and who harvested and got the results?
Yeah, so that's part of the story too, because Art Tanderup, when Mika C. Hornick and one of his friends came with these ancient seeds that had been carried down from Nebraska to Oklahoma over 135 years ago, Art was very skeptical. He said, I don't think these are going to germinate. I don't think this is going to work. And Mika C. was just like, yes, it's going to work. It's going to work. And Art was very surprised that it did. And so they've had a lot of success with that Ponca corn. And the Pawnees, they had something like 19 or 20 different corn varieties, and they lost almost all of them. Like the Poncas, they had taken seeds with them from Nebraska down to Oklahoma. And it took them a while to bring back, but they've now brought back 17 different varieties of corn that they'd almost lost. And another sort of project that I'm somewhat involved in is Kevin and I we did some filming of the Pawnee Seed Preservation Project, which is planting corn, these 17 different varieties on 20 different plots of land here in Nebraska. And these are not where people have said, oh, you can have my land, here it is, it's now yours. It's more, you can use my land to plant this. And oftentimes it's the farmer, him or herself, that is tending the crops, maintaining them. But whether it's the Ponca or the Pawnee, they'll come to plant it and they'll come to harvest it. And sometimes, lots of friendships have formed over this. So sometimes people will be coming up all the time and meeting with the farmers that they've established relationships with. But so that's a really great question as well. And I know that we've interviewed a lot of the people who've made their land available for the farming, and those have established really close relationships, and they seem to be very empowering to all people involved. Yeah.
More questions? Margaret, this was wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.